Hello, my name is Sarah Watts, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Stirling, also a practitioner working part-time at an estate in the Scottish Highlands called Carrower. So my research is about as applied as it is possible to get, with this talk focusing on the results of a tree planting experiment at 3 sites managed for upland habitat restoration. So our big picture context today is, how do we approach conservation science and practice when our study system is so degraded that it might not provide a suitable reference for restoration potential? My study system is mountain woodland, which is the transition zone in mountains from the timberline, where trees and shrubs have an upright growth form, up to the upper altitudinal limits of where they can establish at all. But most of what we have left in this habitat zone in Scotland usually looks like the photos on the left. Tiny population fragments, or even just individual trees literally clinging on in remote and inaccessible locations. This situation is usually thought to be linked to centuries of overgrazing by sheep and deer. Restoration is aiming to move towards photos on the right, a vibrant mosaic of trees and shrubs in our uplands. But practitioners face challenges when knowing what reference system to use as a guide for restoration, because the contemporary distribution of trees and shrubs may not be in equilibrium with the environmental conditions they are able to exploit and thrive in. This conservation challenge may be due to anthropogenic land use legacies, the persistent impacts of human land use on ecosystem properties. Consequently, there's still some uncertainty over the relative importance of natural climatic or human drivers in determining the present extent of Scottish mountain woodlands, and how practitioners can best facilitate effective restoration in such landscapes shaped by large herbivore dynamics. Which leads me to our research questions. Does overgrazing restrict high altitude trees to refugial habitats? And can restoration outcomes be improved by planting outside these constraints? Our study species is dwarf birch, which is a lovely upland shrub with a curious distribution in Britain, and that is found primarily in blanket bog. But these super wet locations are not somewhere you'd normally associate with trees, so what's going on? Well, ecological niche modelling analysis published by Wang et al. In Molecular Ecology determined that the contemporary distribution of this species in Britain is more restricted than the niche it is adapted to occupy. So during my PhD, I wanted to test the hypothesis that dwarf birch occurs in blanket bog as a refuge from overgrazing. And to do this, we set up a 6-year-long tree planting experiment at 3 sites. The aim was to compare survival and growth rates of dwarf birch in different grazing treatments and 3 different habitats: blanket bog and also upland, grassland, and heathland, because the species are found in such places elsewhere in Europe. The first site planted was Ben Lawes. 50 trees were planted in each of the 3 habitats at about 600 metres altitude, all within a fenced exclosure to exclude large herbivores. The second site was Carrower. We replicated the experiment of Ben Lawes inside fences, but also with a further 150 trees planted outside the fences at Carrower at a red deer density of 1 to 3 per square kilometre, which is a very low deer density in the Scottish context. And finally, another 300 trees planted at Finglas, where outside the fence we had a higher red deer density of about 7 per square kilometre. We also had inside the fence, which was again supposed to be no large herbivores, but this is a real-world experiment applicable to the challenges of real-world restoration. And it turned out that the fence was old and porous in places, and there was actually some deer inside the fenced area at a medium density of about 5 per square kilometre, at a lower density than outside the fence at Glenfinglas, but more deer than outside the fence at Carrower. But actually, this turned out to be a really useful opportunity to study the more nuanced effects of a gradient of herbivory. And after planting twice a year, I visited the sites at the beginning and end of the growing season to record whether each tree was alive or dead, record browsing, and measure a range of growth attributes, including height, area, stem diameter, and interannual growth, which compares the shoot increment growth between years. This work amounted to 35 days of fieldwork and produced over 40,000 individual measurements over 6 years, made by myself, and some of the most enjoyable and rewarding fieldwork of my PhD. So now on to the results. First, let's look at survival. These data are modelled using binary, logistic, generalised, linear, mixed models. Firstly, at Ben Lawes, all the dwarf birch were planted inside a fence, so survival was actually really high even after 6 years, and actually, crucially, very similar for all 3 habitats. At Carawa, again, survival was similar for all habitats inside the fence, but outside the fence, on the dashed lines, where there was a low density red deer population, there were actually significantly fewer plants surviving in the heath habitat. And at Glenfinglas, the picture gets really interesting. Outside the fence, where there was a higher red deer density, there was a lot of mortality, and the mortality was much greater in the grass and heath habitats compared to the bog. There was a similar, although less severe result also for inside the fence at Glenfinglas, with an intermediate stocking of deer. And again, grass and heath had lower survival than bog. And virtually all this mortality was attributed to heavy browsing or uprooting by deer. Looking specifically at this deer browsing now, so there's no data, of course, for Ben Lawes because all planting was done inside a fence. Outside the fence at Carawa, the percentage of trees browsed throughout the experiment was significantly greater in the heath and grass compared to the bog. And at Glenfinglas, there was even more browsing, and this browsing was, again, significantly greater in the heath and grass compared to the bog, particularly for the trees in the grass outside the fence, where there was the highest red deer density. It's important to point out that these data are all for deer damage. Browsing damage by small mammals was very limited indeed throughout our experiment. Finally, let's have a quick look at plant growth, and I've just picked out interannual growth to show here because it illustrates the results really nicely, which was similar for all the growth attributes covered. At Ben Lawes, plant growth was actually really similar across all 3 habitat types, and the same was also true at Carawa. And at both sites, we actually picked up a small but significant signal of better growth on the planting in the grass habitat towards the end of the experiment. And at Glenfinglas, the data are even clearer. Interannual growth was significantly greater in both the heath and the grass than in the bog. So let's summarise the main results of this experiment. With deer densities greater than 3 per square kilometre, browsing and mortality of dwarf birch was much greater in the grass and heath than in the blanket bog. But when the large herbivores were excluded, survival was actually similar for all 3 habitats, and some growth outputs were actually better in the grass and heath than the bog, suggesting that the primary present-day habitat of dwarf birch in Scotland, blanket bog, is not more favourable for establishment and growth of this species compared to the potential alternatives of heath and grass habitats. And thus, blanket bog may indeed represent a refugium where relict populations escape from overgrazing. So there's actually a really nice epilogue here with observations from another estate in Scotland. This is Mar Lodge, managed for low density red deer population without the use of fences, and they've been experiencing amazing regeneration of dwarf birch. And where is this occurring incredibly well? In the upland heath habitats, which really nicely echoes the results of our planting experiment. So what are the implications of our research for practice? Well, planting of dwarf birch could successfully take place in grass and heath, with low density large herbivore populations to embed vital habitat connectivity, especially where local seed sources are no longer present. But of course, we need to address the original cause of population declines in the first place, which is overgrazing. And as we've seen at Glen Finglas, fencing is not necessarily a reliable method, while landscape scale large herbivore management is a better option for restoration action at scale. Finally, I think a key objective of mountain woodland restoration should be revival of transitional heterogeneous vegetation, incorporating open ground habitats. However, such mosaics do not fit the discrete conventional habitat types accounted for in the National Vegetation Classification for Britain. Those definitions of plant groups often encompass communities that have been shaped by landscape history and land use, and can even completely omit near extinct assemblages of plants, such as our study system of dwarf birch heathlands. Therefore, vegetation classification should not represent precise instructions for environmental management that are static in time, especially during an era of escalating global change. So, in conclusion, restoration should aim to surpass the constraints of suboptimal refugia, physical barriers such as fencing, and rigid classifications of anthropogenically modified vegetation. Therefore, this study demonstrates the value and application of a thinking outside the box approach, or in the case of dwarf birch, thinking outside the bog, with the aim to move beyond simply replicating the features of contemporary habitat fragments while accounting for historical land use legacies at scale. So that's the end of my talk. Please send any questions to me via the conference app or via email. And also please do use the QR code given here to submit scores for my presentation for the Student Prize competition. And thank you very much for listening.